Good morning. Welcome to Create Connects. This morning we'll be covering singing and group singing. The advice I will give you today has been offered or confirmed by New South Wales Health, SafeWork New South Wales and the Department of Education and Training in New South Wales. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge that all of us here are located somewhere on Aboriginal land across this vast place now called New South Wales. I live and work on Gadigal and Bidjigal lands and pay my respects to elders past, present and future. My name is Beck Dean and I'm an Acting Senior Manager in Policy and Partnerships at Create New South Wales. There are a number of my Create New South Wales colleagues on this platform. Merrily Ray, Ivana Jovanovic and Tammy Close, who will help me to moderate your questions later on. There's a chat box that you can open on the right-hand side of this window. It's got a little speech bubble on it. And you're more than welcome to say hello in there and to also type your questions in there as we go, and then I'll run through those at the end. There's also some good folks at AI Media who are going to be captioning this webinar. And the webinar is also going to be recorded so that others may be able to find this information over the next few weeks. So you can find the caption information also in the chat box at the moment. So we do say here in this housekeeping slide, for a better viewing experience, or if you want to see my face, please click on View Active Cameras. And do use that chat box as we go through. So next slide, please, Ivana. And so this is advice on group singing. If we could go to the next slide. So New South Wales Health has recently updated its advice on group singing. This advice was extended from an initial media release for schools that was published on the 24th of September into advice that is applicable to all situations and settings. So the main detail is that group singing and chanting remains a high risk activity for transmission should someone be infected. In order to mitigate this risk, a small group of up to 5 people may sing together in one area if all singers face forwards and not towards each other. They have physical distancing of 1.5 metres between each other and any other performers, and 5 metres distancing from all other people in front, including the audience and conductor. Group singing of up to 5 people should only take place in a large, well-ventilated, preferably outdoor setting. So I'm just seeing on the chat box there's a couple of people that are having a problem with audio and hoping that everybody else is all right. There are about 140 people on this call. So I think you might need to just check your own audio settings in your computer. Okay, so we also have classroom advice from schools, and that's in the next slide. In primary school and preschool settings, in-class educational activities such as group repetition, chanting and recitation or singing may occur, provided this takes place outdoors or in a well-ventilated indoor environment. Teachers must maintain a 1.5 metre physical distance for these in-class educational activities. This activity is permitted due to the importance of these activities in children's education and development and the lower transmission risk between primary aged students. So it's important to note that this information from New South Wales Health is classified as advice. So it's advice in relation to singing rather than a rule or a law that was written into the current public health order. So it is not a punishable or finable offence to deviate from this advice. However, Create New South Wales would encourage the arts and culture community to heed this advice from New South Wales Health wherever this is possible. Singing is considered risky in the context of COVID-19 as it can transmit aerosols over greater distances than normal speaking can. In the case of singing in groups, the risk of passing on the virus to others in that group is high, so the limit of 5 singers with 5 metres distance between them and other people indicates an upper limit to the virus spreading. If one singer is infected, it is likely that the others will also become infected. The distance from all other people aims to limit the possibility that the act of singing should transmit the virus onto many other people. And so 5 metres is considered a limit of the travel of aerosols from singing in an indoor space, though there are situations in which this distance could be greater. So singers should be, so can we go to that next slide, please, Ivana? So here we go. This is the advice in short. 5 people may sing together. All singers must face forward or in the same direction. And singers are to maintain a 1.5 metre physical distancing from each other. Singers must be 5 metres away from any other person, including the conductor or including an audience. So, Create New South Wales knows there are many professional and community contexts for singing, and that this advice of 5 singers won't support the coherent practice of most groups, including choirs at this time. And so we really thank you for your patience in dealing with the restrictions that have been in place to manage the spread of COVID-19 in New South Wales. So there's a lot of work presently being done behind the scenes to support a return to community arts and culture practice and community music practice along similar lines to community sport, and we hope to be making an announcement about that shortly. And in fact, as you've all registered, we can email you this advice when it comes through. So there's been quite a number of questions on this, and it is due to be imminently answered. But at this time, any activity that brings together more than 5 singers into rehearsal or event will be considered as deviating from or not following the advice of New South Wales Health. So there's also some other advice in relation to education and singing that is might be pertinent to some of the people that are here on this webinar. So this is correct at the time of presentation, that only providers that are essential to the delivery of curriculum can continue to provide services and programs until further notice. Parents and carers and other non-essential visitors are not allowed on the school site unless volunteering for educational purposes. And that singing and other chanting activities can take place in a solo or in a small group as long as participants are 5 metres away from other people and 1.5 metres away from one another. Groups of up to 5 people can include students from different year groups. So I've consulted with New South Wales Department of Education and Training on this advice, and they're very clear that the limitation of non-essential personnel on school grounds is so that schools are able to focus on the safe delivery of the rest of the school curriculum this year for all students. The issue they're trying to avoid at all costs is a COVID-19 infection disrupting the entire HSC timetable of a Year 12 year. And as we know, the spaces that are often used for such exams are the halls that many of you here will be using for band rehearsals. So unfortunately, that is the advice at this time. And I can definitely make this PowerPoint available as part of the stuff that we publish on the website. So if we can move to the next slide. So obviously there are a lot of organisations that are preparing for presentation and performance to audiences now that there's theatres capacities are up to 50%. It makes it much more viable to actually do your work at this time. So in this regard, we've had some advice coming from SafeWork New South Wales for professional organisations or businesses with risk mitigation contingencies in place. So the following advice applies. Professional performance organisations are workplaces and are subject to work health and safety legislation. Any person conducting a business or undertaking has responsibilities under work health and safety legislation and is required to consult with others to manage the risk. Can we go to the next slide, please? The work health and safety principles should be applied to minimise the risk of transmission of COVID-19 among performers, staff and audiences, for example, through increased physical distancing and improved ventilation in indoor settings. Organisations should implement comprehensive COVID-19 safety plans. The onus is on professional performance organisations as employers, in consultation with their staff, to develop appropriate plans and ensure compliance with such plans. Next slide, please. Purpose-built venues and their associated permanent workplaces may have an opportunity to implement specific work practices and engineering controls that may not be viable for infrequent performances or in a community setting. These tailored controls may help augment the approach to meeting the necessary public health outcomes. Where tailored controls are employed, New South Wales Health recommends that organisations obtain specialist professional advice to verify the effectiveness of measures. Please go to the next slide. So, what does this safe work information mean? If your organisation needs to undertake work with singers, which deviates from the advice issued by New South Wales Health, then you will need to professionally manage this risk in and for your workplace. You will need to develop and submit a detailed COVID-safe plan for your workplace, and this is via the usual portal which is available on the New South Wales Government website. You will need to get an external consultant to check your risk management protocols, and this person could be an independent epidemiologist or an occupational health and safety consultant. And finally, you will need to inform all of your staff, your contractors and volunteers and casual workers of the details of your COVID-safe plan and all of the risk mitigations that you're putting in place, and then commit to comply with this plan. So in terms of plans, there's been some brilliant guidelines that have been produced by Live Performance Australia and by the Live Entertainment Industry Forum. Live Performance Australia have some detailed guidelines that cover rehearsal and presentation and performance, and I'd really urge you to take a look at those, especially if you're sort of coming at this whole issue from not very much knowledge. There's already been a huge amount of work done out there in the industry, for the industry, and we recommend that you take a look at these. Now, however, with the caveat that these industry guidelines have been produced for implementation across Australia, and as we know, there are many different situations unfolding across different states and territories. So please do cross-reference the advice that's in the LPA and the leave plans against the actual advice that's coming from New South Wales Health. But they're great, and you should look into them. So now let's look at where you're seeing. So I wanted to discuss this because we have a couple of different kinds of materials that are coming out of New South Wales Health, and we need to understand those things. So one of them is advice about what you can and can't do, and the public health order that limits movement and gathering particularly. And the other thing that they're producing is checklists and limitations and capacity limitations for particular kinds of premises. So you may be working in a range of these different premises, and so you probably need to understand what is also allowable in those contexts. So you'll be aware that theatres, cinemas and concert halls have recently had their capacities lifted to 50%. And you may have noticed also in the context of the media over the last week, 2 weeks, that there is a lot of work being done to support the raising of capacities in other places. So we do anticipate that announcements about these will also come very shortly. So next slide, please. So if you are an organisation or a group that is undertaking singing in a group, you want to put together a COVID-safe plan so that everybody knows their sort of responsibilities as well as your responsibilities to them. So you have a COVID-safe plan, and then you have responsibility to the people that you're engaging with. And then when you go into a venue, that venue is likely to have a specific COVID-safe plan relating to what can happen in that venue. So it's important that you sort of also cross-reference this and engage for the venue or the centre or the community hall that you're working in, so that they understand what you need to undertake in their space, and that you understand what is basically available to you through this process. So it's really advised that you engage with that premises and make sure that their COVID safety plan includes the provision for the kind of work or performance you're undertaking, or to make sure that their agreement with you as a hirer makes clear the very specific responsibilities that you each hold. Can you move on to the next slide, please? Okay, so I've received a number of frequently asked questions prior to, in fact, a lot of these questions are very similar, but they usually have different metrics around them, like numbers of people. So I've multiple groups of 5 singing possible if space permits at 5 metres distance from each other. This is basically the same advice as I gave at the start of this, is that while the singing rules are not stipulated in the public health orders directly, they are required to address, you're required to address the matters in your safety plan. So if you're deviating from the New South Wales Health advice around 5 singers only, then the onus is on you to explain how you have managed your risk. And so if you want to deviate from advice, such as multiples of 5 people, then you need to obtain your own advice to ensure that you're doing this safely. And the same thing is for the second question, is exactly the same. And I do want to reiterate, for those of you who arrived also late to this conversation, there will be, we are anticipating an imminent announcement of outdoor community music practice in line with the outdoor community sport guidelines that are available at the moment. So this will be covered very shortly. And I will email all of you who have come onto this webinar to give you that information when it arrives. The next question that I had is, what's the best way for event organisers to offer an easy to use and implement COVID safe sign-in info for an event? So obviously events are really different. The ways that it's allowable for you to do sign-in for performance at a theatre is that ticketing system is adequate. So if someone has booked a ticket either for themselves or for a group of people, then that is deemed adequate in terms of contact tracing. So if you wanted to do something different, or if you wanted to add to that, then there is a new tool. It's a free tool that's been developed by Service New South Wales, which is a QR code, and that's where you're able to basically implement the use of that QR code in your venue, and people use their phones to check in. So there's a couple of ways that you can do things. I will now go through, there's quite a number of questions in the chat box already, and there are a number of questions about what I've just said, and imminent is very soon, so within the next day or so. So I was really hoping for the announcement to come before this webinar so I could actually run through the detail of that with you, but we're anticipating that it will be very shortly, and I'll email you the detail of that as soon as it comes through. All right, now I'm just going to go through the questions, and it just might take me a moment, so excuse me if this is awkward. Okay. Okay, so I think I've been through this. There's a question about, is this a recommendation or advice or a law? It isn't a law in the public health order, it's an advice. You have a, there's an expectation, and this is, I guess this is the case for every single area of practice and work in New South Wales at the moment. It's basically a self-managed system. So every organisation, every business is producing COVID-safe plans that outline all of their risk mitigation strategies in their workplace. And so this is really, you know, the advice is for singing is on top of that sort of expectation that you manage safely the practice that you're undertaking. So it's not a law, but it is very strong advice because there is risk in there. At the moment, there's questions about primary schools, and the information about primary schools, I might just get Ivana to bring this up. But the only things that are permissible currently are things that relate to the curriculum. If they don't relate to the curriculum, if they're additional activities, then they're not allowed to be delivered at this time. The guidelines that have been released, or the advice that's been released for singing, applies to everyone in all circumstances. So there's a question about whether it applies to community playgroups, and I would suggest that's similar because it's outside of the school context. So there's someone saying that there's no evidence supporting what I've been saying about school students and Year 12 students undertaking exams, but I've got that advice from New South Wales Health, and New South Wales Education and Training, and they are very keen to take students safely through the rest of the school year. And that is the priority for those schools at the moment. Okay, so primary school choirs, there's a question about it, and I guess it depends on whether that choir is part of the curriculum or if it's a choir that takes place in the context of the classroom. If it takes place in the context of the classroom, then that would seem to be allowed, but if it's outside of the context of the curriculum or the classroom, then it seems like those things are not allowed at the moment. Is there a minimum time between choirs of 5 singers using the same well-ventilated hall? There isn't advice around that, Georgina. We have also had the same sorts of questions that have applied to audiences coming into performances. It's basically up to that venue really to understand the capacity for ventilation in that space and to make those take those risk measures. And there's another question about teachers. Teachers must maintain 1.5 metres physical distancing from in-class education activities. Could we include the link to the free QR code? Yes, it's just, hopefully someone will be able to drop that in there. Does the use of PPE allow singers to be less than 5 metres away from others? Again, it's something that falls outside of the specific advice of New South Wales Health. So if you were to use PPE, you would need to undertake your own risk mitigation and get that looked at by somebody external. So there are questions about the 1.5 metres distance, and if you want, I can go back through the information provided by SafeWork New South Wales. You are able to undertake other kinds of, undertake to do the play, the event, the musical that you're doing, but you need to make sure that you get your COVID safe plans looked at and your plans for keeping your performers and your people safe looked at by someone and signed off by someone. Someone's been asking what the study is based on. The advice is based on actual incidents of choirs becoming infected, and in fact, the advice is based on, or there is evidence that this has actually taken place in the community in New South Wales, and death has occurred. So it's very serious advice. There is a question about the use of Inclass. So the advice that I've got from New South Wales Education, and perhaps there's someone from New South Wales Education on the line, if they might want to clarify this, but basically anything that's involved with the delivery of the curriculum is okay to proceed, and things that aren't, things that are extracurricular and things that invite people that are not engaged in the delivery of curriculum are not permitted currently on school grounds. What is the public liability insurance risk if you don't follow the policy? Well, I think this is a very important question, and it's up to you as the organiser of this event to actually run a risk matrix of these issues and decide whether you want to take the risk of being sued over your activities. I don't know anyone that's actually been sued from, contacting COVID-19, but we actually don't know what this situation will bring about legally in the future. Louise Withers has a question. Would an organiser be deemed negligent if they did not follow this advice from New South Wales Health? Would insurance providers be able to use this as a case, even if the organisation had a COVID-19 in place? Is the only way to protect the organiser to register and ensure the COVID-19 plan is officially approved? Yeah, this is basically the only way that you can do this at the present time, is to undertake to do your own risk mitigation. So it's like everybody is doing this at the moment, all workplaces are doing this at the moment, and this would be no different. So please, if you are intending to undertake to do a performance or presentation, that you make everybody in your organisation, everybody that's participating, aware of your responsibilities and their responsibilities to complying with your plan. I would suggest that for the curriculum, if it's the music curriculum and that it's part of their education activities in primary schools, and they should be able to undertake to do that work. But if it's external to the curriculum, or if you're a provider that's external to that curriculum delivery, then it's currently not permitted. Yes, and we'll make sure all of this information is available. I can also put the PowerPoint up on our website after this. And just the differences in terms of states. The states are very different at the moment because the rate of infection is very different in states at the moment. So, for instance, in Queensland, they've had basically no cases for a very long time, and that is why they're able to run with 30 people. We have active cases of COVID transmission in our community. We were doing so well for about a week, and now that obviously is a different case. But Queensland, obviously, they've closed the border. They're being very measured in their approach, but they are in a different stage to us in terms of COVID-19. So someone asked if there's a list of epidemiologists. Mike, I do have the contact for someone that I can send you. I also note that the Live Performance Australia guidelines and the LEAF guidelines have also been signed off by an independent epidemiologist, so they're a good place to start, I think, in doing that work. Someone's asking about masks on or masks off. The advice about 5 people and 5 metres is the advice. That's the extent of the advice. So anything that you choose to do outside of this advice, you may, of course, undertake to use masks, but that's currently not in the advice. Is there any indication as to whether these guidelines are going to extend into 2021? This will depend entirely on how we progress through this pandemic. So if we come to the end of the year with very little transmission or zero transmission, then things are likely to change. I mean, the government, as far as it possibly can, is trying to work to open up our economies, open up what we're able to do, but it really depends on how we track with this. So timelines, they're not really able to be confirmed or denied because they are in fact subject to what happened with this pandemic. Someone asks about finding people in regional New South Wales to seek advice from. I think you could. I think that you could probably get advice for this kind of activity through digital means. I don't think people would need to actually come to you to give you that advice. But of course, it's preferable to have someone that you can talk to about these things. But I think, you know, occupational health and safety people, they are around. So I would suggest you can find them. It might just be digital. There's someone that's confused about their school choir of 50 singers. Now, again, can we have a look at the advice for schools? Ivana? Okay, so there is a little bit more, probably not the next slide, but the one afterwards. Okay. So here, your school choir, you say your school choir has 50 singers. Your school choir, I imagine there might be some issues of this because from different year groups, up to 5 students is okay. I'm imagining your 50 singers is from different school groups. So I think you really need to be liaising with your school about this. It seems to me that in classroom activities of singing are okay. but there are challenges around larger groups. However, I would like to say please stay tuned, because there will be advice about community music practice delivered very shortly, which might actually support to all of these questions to be answered in a much simpler way. Is there a list of approved people who can sign off on COVID safe plans? No, there isn't. I could do a little bit of investigating into this. Obviously, at Create New South Wales, we wouldn't be able to endorse a range of private providers. But I can do a little search, and maybe Natasha, you can get in touch with me directly, or any of you actually, if you want to email me. I think if we go to the end, my email address is there, and you can contact me there if you feel like your questions haven't been answered well enough, or if you want to ask other questions. Please come on board. Eva has asked, she's a music teacher delivering primary music curriculum. I would suggest that you, from the advice that we just went through, that you are able to undertake the work within your curriculum and in the context of a classroom, an in-class activity. And there is less risk of transmission between these groups. There's another question about face shields being considered helpful in risk mitigation. The advice from health is that face shields are only helpful if you can't maintain physical distance. So physical distance and the 1.5 metres that we're used to is the physical distance that that is preferred, and face masks are basically a mitigation in case you can't do that activity. There is a question about seniors, and I can't see where that question is, Ivana. If you could post it for me, please. What rules apply to seniors singing together? It's exactly the same advice applies to seniors as any other person. So, you know, but obviously seniors are in a higher risk category. So you might question whether you actually want to undertake this activity at all, I would suggest. Can you answer the question about commercial productions? How can Pippin be going on stage given this advice? I did cover that earlier in the this. So the organisers of Pippin would have done some consultation, and I actually understand from looking at the chat box that the epidemiologist that they've been doing consultation with is actually here. And they would have done consultation and developed a COVID safe plan so that they can deliver their project. Yeah. And from the advice that we have from education, students from the same classroom seem to be okay to rehearse together, but if they're from different classrooms, it's only up to 5. I do believe that I've covered off most of the questions here, but really, basically, the advice is 5 people, 5 metres. That is the advice. Anything that falls outside of that is subject to your own risk mitigation strategies, your own COVID safe planning, your own responsibilities. However, I will just remind everyone that there will be an announcement very shortly. I wish that it had happened this morning, so I could take it up with you at this time. But I will email everybody that's been on this webinar so that we can talk through, so that I can send you that advice from New South Wales Health about community outdoor music practice. So I really hope that we get some good outcomes for all of these very grey areas that everyone's having to operate within. And so I do want to thank you all for your patience in engaging with this very challenging time. It is difficult. If you do have questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me. Trying to get as much clarity as I can over these issues. Obviously, there's a lot of grey area between what is a workplace, what is a community place, what is an education context, and where those sorts of differences kind of sometimes fall between the gaps. So do get in touch, and I hope that the new advice coming shortly will give you much relief. Thank you.